Hello everyone, Dr. Sparkle here. Welcome to the very delayed 43rd episode of Chrontendo. Today we'll be covering all of March 1989, and once again we've gone over the standard 15 game per episode limit and have a mind-numbing 20 games to get through. 3 of these will be US only releases, including 2 from a brand new US publisher. I think the key word this episode, other than crap, is going to be adventure games, because we have a few of those today. Let's get started. Right out of the gates, it's Bandai with SD Gundam World, Gachapon Senshi Scramble Wars Map Collection. Maybe this intro looks familiar? Well, I hate to break the news to you, but this is not a real sequel to the first SD Gundam Wars game. Nope, this is just like the title says, a map collection. The exact same game, just with some new campaigns. And the campaigns here are pretty much just maps, basically. There's no storyline or anything like that. So if you played through the entire SD Gundam game and want more, I guess give this one a try. Now something else that I should point out is this is actually the very last Famicom Disk System game from Bandai. Episode 43 also contains the very last FDS game from Jalico. After this, the only other established video game company to keep putting out new games on the FDS is Nintendo, though there still will be a handful of games from guys like Pack-In Video and Takuma Shoten. Bandai's reign of terror finally comes to an end. Yep, Bandai had been on a real spree in late February and early March. Episode 42 had 5 Bandai games, and now there's 2 already on March 3rd. So that's 7 games in a time period of a little over 2 weeks. That works out to about a game every 2 days. After this, Bandai would slow way the hell down on the Famicom games. In fact, they only came out with around 7 more games for the entire rest of 1989. Once again, Bandai has teamed up with Tosa to produce this gem, Sakigake Otokojuku Shippu Ichi Gosei. Naturally, this was based on a manga and anime series. The original work is sort of actually a kind of parody, and concerns a school of absurdly macho and jingoistic Japanese martial arts, manly man type dudes. The animated series aired during 1988. In the past, I've concluded that Tosa does better when dealing with things like adventure games that don't require like level design or combat systems or collision physics or any of that sort of stuff. Sakigake Otokojuku adds more evidence to this theory, since it's pretty awful. It's a very basic beat 'em up. You encounter enemies one at a time, you can attack them using a punch or a kick. You can also attempt a jumping kick if you want, but that's about it. If there are any special moves, I couldn't find them. Most enemies will go down with a single punch or kick, but every once in a while you'll encounter a slightly different guy who takes multiple hits. And sometimes your attack won't connect for some unknown reason. I guess it has to do with the weird collision detection. And there is some bizarre stuff in this game. Like here, I thought this guy was a boss, since he kept getting up after I knocked him down. I kept fighting him, slowly getting my health worn down. And here you can actually see that some of the punches don't really seem to connect, even though they look like they should. After a while I had to switch characters and I still couldn't defeat him. This was looking like the longest boss battle ever, when I suddenly realized I could just exit through the door. Now I'm thinking this wasn't really a boss fight, but just that a new enemy would respawn infinitely in the exact same spot where the last enemy died. So I was really just fighting a never-ending series of the same enemy over and over again without realizing it. You may have already noticed this, but the developers were so lazy that despite the fact that there are 4 playable characters, they all use the same in-game sprite. The characters all look different when you see their portrait in the lower left, but the sprite that you control is always like a generic guy with black hair, except during the boss battles it seems, because here he has blonde hair like the character. I mean, they created a different character sprite for this scene, so why couldn't it be used for the rest of the game? The boss battle takes place in the big open field, and there's some sort of depth to it, so the characters can move in front of or behind each other. But the weird thing is when you throw a hit, you'll actually hit whatever lines up with your fist horizontally. So if you were standing slightly in the foreground compared to the boss and throw a punch, you'll hit his knees. So the characters still sort of exist in 2D space, even though it's kind of like a 3D setting here. This is actually the trick to beating this guy. Stand below him so that you can like punch him in the legs or the crotch, but he can't hit you because his fist will go above your head. After the boss battle, you'll get more of the same damn thing, same background and everything. Really, shouldn't the game reward you with like a second level that's not identical to the first? I know that later in the game it changes scenery a bit, but no way was it going to pursue this game any further. So, great job Bandai and Tosa, marches off to a fantastic start because of you. Namco makes its first of 2 appearances today with Hayauchi Super Igo, developed by Home Data, which was a software company that seemed to specialize in shogi and mahjong games. They're still around, but now under the name Magical. Hayauchi Super Igo is, not surprisingly, an Ego game. Ego, often called just Go, is an ancient Chinese game which is also quite popular in Japan. This is the second Go game we've seen. The first was from Bulletproof Software and was supposedly the only Famicom game that Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamaguchi ever played himself, though apparently only for a few minutes. Namco's Go game seems pretty straightforward. You can choose your handicap. Worst players will start the game with several pieces already on the board. The object is to surround the other player's pieces with your own pieces and capture them. Now, Go is one of the few board games in which a computer cannot defeat an expert human player, at least not yet. However, a computer can easily defeat an incompetent player like myself. Since I know nothing about Go's strategy, I will repeatedly get my ass handed to me over and over again. Oh well. At least it still looks like a pretty decent little game. Alright, here we go. One of the games I've been looking forward to for a while, Jesus Kyofu no Biomonster, or Jesus Dreadful Biomonster as it's sometimes called. You see, this is one of those games where you have the title and you go, whoa, what the hell is that game about? I mean, come on, Jesus Dreadful Biomonster? How can that be a real game? And it's by Enix? Really? Right off the bat, the music sounds familiar. That's because it's from our main man, Koichi Sugiyama, known for his Dragon Quest music. Well, having played the game, I'm afraid I have to inform you that it's not half as weird or as interesting as it sounds. In fact, it's a pretty typical sci-fi anime-infused adventure game, though one with better than average production values. After the cool little intro, the game starts off in a goofy way, with a video game playing nerd eating a hamburger. Now fortunately we have an English translation done under the name Nihak, perhaps. It's a solid translation, though the English had to be greatly compressed and abbreviated and so on in order to make it squeeze into the space occupied by the Japanese characters. The game first appeared under the name Jesus on Japanese computers in 1987. Here's the PC-88 version, which naturally has more detailed artwork than the Famicom version. The computer Jesus games tend to look much more anime-like, and most of the names in the credits are not familiar, to me at least, aside from Sugiyama and the fellow who did the art, Shintaro Majima, who later became the main dude in Arte Piazza, mostly known for porting various versions of the Dragon Quest games. They did the DS ports, for example. Different sources state the developer as Jesus as being either Enix or Chunsoft. Those two companies, of course, were deeply connected, but I don't know which company the staff was actually working for. Well, first of all, the Famicom Jesus seems to be a very accurate port. This starts off looking quite interesting. When you talk to the commander, you have some dialogue options like ask, praise, and flatter, So right away you think, wow, this is like some BioWare type game. Maybe you can try different approaches to talking to NPCs and open up branching dialogue paths, and, well, actually no. It's a red herring. This is the only time those options appear, and they do absolutely nothing. Jesus Kyofo no Biomonster is an extremely linear game, with exactly one correct approach to everything. Your first task is to pass out ID cards. Sounds simple. There are 3 rooms to enter. Talk to the folks and give them their cards. One of them is your musician girlfriend. The manual states she's 17, and she'll play this totally awesome tune that she composed. Yeah, that is one sick jam. So how did a teenage keyboard player end up on a military space mission? This is Japan, I suppose. You also meet her weird little robot pet thing, Foji, who ends up being an NPC you deal with the most. Okay, so here's where the trouble starts. You enter all these rooms, give everyone an ID card, head back to the commander. You then tell them you're not done yet. Well, what didn't I do? So try heading back to the rooms. Oh, and now there's a new guy in the rec room. Okay, so you talk to him and give him the card, and then you go back and you still say you're not done yet. Okay, so you head back to the rooms, but there's no one new to be found. This seems to be a dead end, and the game gives you absolutely no clues as to why you're not done handing out the cards. Doesn't even tell you how many cards you have left, you're just apparently not done somehow. You see, after you've given the ship's doctor her ID card, it turns out you have to use the look command on her and then the talk command multiple times. After you've used these commands the requisite number of times, so suddenly open up, say she's troubled and needs your help with something. This little plot thread goes absolutely nowhere, but it does open up the last room so you can give away the last card. But this is really quite strange. Your character certainly knows who he's supposed to give the cards to, and where their rooms are. But you, the player, don't know this. Your character could just go pass out the cards to them at any time, but their existence is not even revealed to you, the player, until you just happen to stumble upon the correct and unrelated dialogue option. The game is divided into 3 parts. The first is the card passing out part, which takes place on Jesus, a space station orbiting Earth. Yes, Jesus is the name of the space station, who knows why, but after this beginning part you leave and then never come back for the entire rest of the game. The plot involves an expedition to Halley's Comet. The actual main game itself kicks into gear when some sort of trouble occurs on the ship that's exploring the comet. You choose to investigate, and the second part involves you exploring this ship, which is actually called the Comet, confusingly. Once you're aboard, you run into Foji and find the ship is empty and quite dead. You and Foji spend quite a lot of time walking around, looking at floors, ceilings, walls, control panels, and so on. You find some obviously important things, like the bodies of crew members, but most of the ship seems pretty unremarkable. Now, despite how unremarkable everything is, you still have to examine every single last little thing in this game, often multiple times in order to find the invisible triggers that cause the next important event to occur. There are several floors on the ship, and each floor has several rooms that are connected by a circular walkway. You move from room to room by controlling your character directly, rather than using a menu. These sections are pretty unique, but they're only used at this one point in the game. Everything else is completely menu-based. Some parts actually make sense, like finding someone's keycard, which can then be used to open something or use a computer. Other parts are more frustrating. You see a lot of machines and devices that have options to look at them or use them, but you're told you shouldn't touch it 90% of the time. Or in one segment you'll find some weapons, but you can only take one. Which one? Well, you need to guess. I don't recall getting any sort of hints, but it turns out to be the freeze ray. Here's one part where the game starts getting really annoying. By this time you've already encountered the alien a few times, and you know it's sensitive to cold. Your freeze gun, however, is out of energy. Now previously you noticed a valve that controls some sort of liquid oxygen coolant. Obviously this will be used to freeze the alien, but when you try to use it, Foji tells you it's too dangerous. Really? Too dangerous? More dangerous than an alien who's going to rip your face off any second? So you do the usual stuff, look at the valve, look at your surroundings, try the valve again. Foji still freaks out and tells you not to turn it on. I mean, how do you make yourself turn on the damn valve and freeze the alien? I mean, well, here's the solution. Despite already being told the gun is out of energy and useless, and there's no logical reason to try it again, trying to use the gun a third time will suddenly change the use valve option, and finally let you turn on the damn valve and freeze the alien like you've been trying to do. And then after you've done this, the alien is injured and a piece drops off. That sounds pretty important, right? Let's go pick up that piece of alien. Nope, the game refuses to let you pick it up, yet. Instead, you need to walk to the cockpit, contact the other ship and tell them what happened. Then, someone asks you to bring back the piece of the alien. So you gotta trek all the way back to the freezer room, and now it'll let you pick it up. And this is one distinguishing characteristic of these kind of games. They often don't let you do things logically. Instead, they make you find the specific order that the game wants you to do them in. There's a brief section where you need to guess which order to press a series of buttons, and then you head back to the other ship, where it again turns out there's an alien loose, and once again people get killed. This pink-haired lady gets a rather dramatic dying scene. Now, despite the alien being really scary looking, it apparently kills people by sticking something into their finger with a little tiny needle. The creature does this so it can get the DNA, which it then uses to mutate. So it kind of adds a bit of like John Carpenter's The Thing into Ridley Scott's Alien. I'm not sure how successful this game was, but it did receive a computer-only sequel, Jesus 2. Here's the PC-98 version. This intro really shows up the inspiration to the movie Alien. Much, but not all of the original staff remains. The sequel is, once again, an adventure game, but due to its somewhat later vintage, it has much more detailed graphics. Anyway, the last part of the game is much like the second part, walking around it looking at stuff for no apparent reason. Once you've looked at everything the game wants you to look at, you'll trigger the next event. More people die, off-screen. Also, a tape playing your girlfriend's keyboard tune mysteriously gets smashed. Before too long, you, your girlfriend, and the captain are the only ones left. You get to see the alien in all its H.R. Giger-inspired glory, and then the captain bravely sacrifices himself. You also have a hilariously protracted scene in which you debate whether you should try to help the captain. I guess the alien kills its victims very, very slowly. Finally, we reach the end. The alien has obtained human intelligence and speech, and is going to head to Earth with all its alien buddies and take over the Earth. The aliens are hiding out in Halley's Comet. By the way, that makes the second game we've seen in which aliens invade Earth via Halley's Comet. Halley Wars was the other one. At this point, you and Foji have to do some detective work in order to determine the alien's secret weakness. This takes the form of a quiz. Foji asks you various questions about the game so far. And if you got any of the questions wrong, even if you came to the correct conclusion, Foji makes you start all over again. Now the answer, which has been blatantly telegraphed throughout the game, is that your girlfriend's musical composition will kill the alien. So yeah, you gotta pull out her keyboard and play her tune, which is so terrible it can actually annihilate living creatures. This is done through another guessing game in which you need to hit the right keys on the keyboard. Well, I'll assume the developers actually thought that the song was like so pure-hearted, and that it actually destroyed the creature through like the power of love or something like that, rather than just being a really terrible, deadly song. And then things get ultra corny when it turns out that all the spirits of your dead friends still somehow live on inside the alien, and they all take turns giving you words of encouragement. So, Jesus Kyofu no Biomonster is sort of a disappointing game. I mean, it's a pretty standard sci-fi adventure game in many ways. It's more tightly plotted, has better developed characters and better art than most other games like this we've seen, and it looks pretty good in comparison to Square's Famicom adventure games. But it doesn't have as much character as, say, Hudson's Princess Tomato, and it does suffer from all those irritating issues that other games in this genre have. And I'm not even sure why it's called Jesus. I mean, the space station Jesus barely even figures into the game, and once you leave it at the beginning, you never come back. And whose idea was it to name a space station Jesus anyway? The end is pretty funny. Now that everyone but them is dead, and they have the ship all to themselves, you and your girlfriend take the opportunity to get busy. But you saved the world, so I guess you deserve it. Here's another one from Namco. This time it's one that you've heard of, Rolling Thunder, a port of Namco's influential arcade game. It seems this port was handled by Nova. Alright, so this is Story 1, Area 1. The game is divided into quote-unquote stories. I'm not sure if story means story like floors in a building, or story as in telling a story. But Rolling Thunder is one of those walk from left to right and shoot things games. But it's virtually the prototype for this sort of game. It came out in arcades back in 1986. One thing you'll notice is the arcade game has like a life bar of sorts. This has been changed a bit for the home version. The original was a cool, fun little game, and would go on to influence such games as Sega's Shinobi. Well, certainly the home version has taken a bit of a hit, graphics-wise. Your character looks really tall and thin, and that's not just because we're playing it in the unstretched resolution. He is pretty well animated, however, and has decent animations for jumping, ducking, and so on. The bad guys are mostly in the form of these hooded dudes. Almost everyone refers to them as looking like KKK members, but I think they were more inspired by villains from like the older pulp action spy genre. Depending on their color, they may be armed with guns and may take multiple hits to kill. You will occasionally find a marked door that leads to a room containing ammo. There are two types, pistol or machine gun ammo, both are rather limited. Here I just got the machine gun ammo, listed as MG-BLT. The levels are mostly horizontal with a bit of vertical movement from time to time. There's not really much atmosphere, everything is pretty nondescript looking, it's like sort of typical secret base type stuff. For some reason there are a bunch of tires in here. Oh yeah, this right here is one of the most irritating occurrences in the game, where you get into a firefight with a guy hiding behind a crate or something. You have to sort of stick your head up and fire off a couple rounds, then duck down to avoid getting shot. It's almost impossible to hit the guy since he does the exact same thing. He ducks down when you shoot at him. This can waste a lot of ammo and time, and Rolling Thunder does like a timer counting down. If it runs out, you have to start again. With the guys behind the crates, you sort of have to memorize where they are, so you can start walking towards him while firing, so you can hopefully hit him as soon as he appears on the edge of the screen. And sometimes these guys will even start shooting at you while they're still off-screen, and naturally they can shoot you from off-screen, but you can't shoot them. One of the more colorful parts of Rolling Thunder are the between-level cutscenes. These show the bad guys watching your kidnapped girlfriend on a big video monitor, usually while doing some sort of like crazy dance moves. The whole girlfriend in peril thing was pretty common in video games, but Rolling Thunder's cutscenes are pretty creepy as they look like some sort of sexual assault is just about ready to occur, or has just occurred. I guess you can file Rolling Thunder next to Menace Beach in this department. The home version is a bit harder in some ways than the arcade game. First of all, your life bar is only 2 dots, and as far as I know, it can never be expanded. However, the life bar only applies being punched by an enemy. If you are shot, you will always die, regardless of whether you have full life bar or not. Enemies start getting a bit more aggressive as you progress. You'll encounter guys throwing bombs that they will both throw horizontally and vertically at you. One of your major weaknesses is you cannot fire your gun while jumping. In order to dispatch enemies on a level above you, you'll need to climb up to their level. However, a common occurrence is that while jumping up a level, the enemy will suddenly turn around and shoot you while you're still in midair and completely defenseless. Also, enemies tend to shoot you the second they appear at the edge of the screen, or will even drop down from nowhere onto your head, so once again memorization is key. Eventually you'll start facing some non-human enemies like weird jumping monkey things, and attack dogs, and flying creatures that look sort of like giant bats with duck feet. Even weirder are these guys that look kind of like the Human Torch, and who explode into deadly fragments when killed. Now quite frankly, if our hero was as agile as someone like Simon Belmont, then this wouldn't be so bad. But the fact that you cannot attack unless both feet are firmly planted on the ground makes flying enemies much trickier. Also, the jumping controls are really stiff. You cannot control your jump at all, or even vary the length of your jump. It's easy to overshoot when jumping from platform to platform. Once you reach the end of Story 1, it's revealed the bad guy is some green alien-looking dude. It's not really clear from playing the game, but Rolling Thunder supposedly has a science fiction theme, or at least the arcade version did. Overall, Rolling Thunder is not a bad game, though a little old-fashioned by 1989 standards, or at least compared to Shinobi. In Shinobi you had multiple types of attacks, as well as ninja magic. In Rolling Thunder, you only have your gun. Now, a number of small frustrations add up to an overall experience that's sort of unpleasant. Like here, for example. How do you get past this guy? He takes multiple hits to kill, and the first hit will push him back into like this choke point. And once he's standing here, he's one level below you, so you cannot shoot him even if you duck down. And then, of course, he's throwing a constant stream of grenades to create a seemingly impassable barrier. Is it possible to slip between the grenades? I tried, but I sure couldn't. So it seems like you're kind of stuck here. Now it turns out you can backtrack a bit and make him disappear and then go forward again, but was that really what the developers were intending, or is that just a weird bug? Anyway, Rolling Thunder did receive a US release. Like several other Namco games, it was published by Tengen, who, as you might recall, had very strong ties to Namco. It was an unlicensed game, of course, but it's exactly the same as the Japanese version, as far as I know. The first of two title games today is Bakushou Jinsei Gekijou. That's Bakushou with 2 exclamation points, mind you. The attentive viewers out there might be thinking, Jinsei, why is this another video game based on the classic board game, The Game of Life? Why, you are correct. Now this is for up to 4 players. I don't know who actually developed Bakushou, but man, is that some nasty music, and the graphics aren't too great either. It works exactly like you think it would. Each person takes a turn rolling the dice, and then you move around on the board. In terms of interactivity, that's really about it right there, just pressing the dice roll button. Well, there are a few other moments later in the game. Most of the beginning of the game is dedicated to school. You start off in elementary school. You get some cash as a gift upon entering school, and the first player who gets out of school gets twice as much cash. At various points in the game, there are bonuses for being the first to arrive at a certain point on the board. And there are, unsurprisingly, RPG elements shoehorned into this game. You have stats, such as intelligence, luck, and strength. Landing on certain spaces will trigger events that'll cause a stat to gain or lose points. And these stats are actually important a little bit later. High strength can get you a pro baseball career, and high intelligence will allow you to go to college and get a better job later. Certain spaces will trigger a minigame of some sort. Naturally, Taito throws in an Arkanoid minigame. If you do really well, you'll get a luck bonus. A little later, there's like this weird shooting game where you can win additional intelligence. Oh look, the Famicom makes an appearance here. Now the pacing on this seems pretty deliberate compared to similar games. As I mentioned, you start off in elementary school, and then a bit later you go to middle school, and then further down the board, high school. And this can take a while, especially with 4 players. After school, there are quite a few career options and life choices available. One career is going into the Yakuza. Bakushou looks pretty involved, and I'm not sure how long it would take to play a full game, but probably quite a while. Now there are some things I don't like, other than, as mentioned, the horrible music and graphics, but one thing is you can't see where the other players are on the board while it's your turn. So it's not really obvious where you are in relation to everybody else, unless you just happen to remember where all the other players left off. Also, the hand rolling the dice looks sort of inappropriate. So it's not the slickest looking Jinsei game ever, but it seems pretty decent. Let's take a moment to check out some US releases. March 1989 sees the debut NES game from Milton Bradley, the enormous and long-lived toy and game company. World Games was originally published by Epyx, but here we have that distinctive screen found in most Rare games. Yep, this was once again ported over by Rare. In a rather weird coincidence, the previous game was based on the Game of Life, which was Milton Bradley's first commercially released game from 1860. They went on to become one of the biggest board game manufacturers, and by the late 70s were becoming involved in electronic games, such as Simon, which was an electronic memorization game. They entered the video game field in 1979 with the rather obscure Microvision, which was the first cartridge-based handheld game system, and also the Vectrex, the short-lived vector graphics console, so it was only natural they would get into the Nintendo Entertainment System action, though they never became a major player in the world of video games. By 1989, they had been purchased by Hasbro, who of course later purchased Atari Corporation. This is the other half of Atari, not the guys behind Tengen. By another weird coincidence, in 1989 Atari would release their handheld console, the Lynx, which was designed by Epyx, the same guys who published the original computer version of World Games, so it's a very small, incestuous video game world here. Anyway, World Games was originally for the Commodore 64 in 1986, a sequel to Summer Games and Winter Games, though I don't think it was quite as successful as the earlier titles in the series. The events featured like a weird hodgepodge of such sports as weightlifting, log rolling, and bull riding. The game is probably inspired by the real-life World Games, sort of an alternate Olympics for sports which are not in the real Olympics. Coincidentally, the World Games began in the Bay Area, same part of the world where Epyx was based and Atari was based for that matter. Just like the Winter Games, World Games is a series of sports competitions, and just like Winter Games and similar titles like Skate or Die, the main challenge is to understand how to control the game. To perform well in each event, you have to enter in an arcane series of button presses. In weightlifting, use the up and down buttons in succession, but the timing has to be just right. This is almost like a rhythm game, but lacking the visual or audio cues that you normally have in rhythm games. Literally, World Games is not the prettiest video game we've ever seen. It is, however, far better looking than Winter Games, which was ported by a Japanese contract developer and released by Acclaim in the US. Rare was a pretty eccentric company, and the results were often sketchy, but they seem to have a handle on the material here. If Winter Games rated a 1 on a scale of 1 to 10, I guess World Games is a solid 5. Game number 2 from Milton Bradley is another port, this time of an arcade game. Marble Madness, copyrighted to Tengen, that is, to Atari Games. I'm not sure why Atari licensed this to Milton Bradley of all people. I don't know if Marble Madness is the sort of game that kids like playing nowadays. The object is simply to maneuver a marble through a level within a certain time limit. It's a pretty short game, only 6 levels. If you were well skilled, you could finish it in a few minutes. The fact there is no plot, characters, special powers, or anything really, makes it seem a bit simple by today's standards. Though I'll confess, I loved the arcade version of Marble Madness back in the day. Originally released in 1984, it seemed unlike anything else in arcades at the time. Its isometric 3D levels made it stick out a bit, and this game had really good physics for a 1984 game. The marble has weight, and you must deal with momentum, contact with enemies or walls. It was the first game I can recall where it felt like you were controlling an actual physical object in real space. The game was designed by Mark Cerny. It was his first game, I believe. Later, of course, he went on to produce Crash Bandicoot, Spyro the Dragon, and now does game consulting, mostly for Naughty Dog. This home version was developed by, who else? Rare, which makes sense considering the whole isometric graphics thing. It looks pretty good, but any port of Marble Madness will be hampered by the controls. The game originally used a trackball, which is a perfectly logical choice. The marble and the trackball are sort of shaped the same, and it feels almost like you're directly controlling the marble by moving the trackball. Using a D-pad or some kind of other controller, it just isn't the same. I found the marble to be pretty hard to control, and fell off of ledges a lot. Parts that were not that difficult on the original game, like navigating paths with lots of turns and twists, are very tricky using the D-pad. So Marble Madness is a commendable effort, but definitely falls short. Still, it's worth checking out if you want to try playing an unusual classic. Okay, we have just one more US game. This one is John Elway's Quarterback, published by Tradewest, and as the title screen states, it's ported to the NES by Rare. So for Western games, Rare is 3 for 3 today. I'm not sure if you remember who Tradewest is, but they were the same guys who released Double Dragon in the US. They had a certain amount of success in the video game field, then got snatched up by another company and disappeared. The game has its origins in a series of games from Leland. Here's Quarterback from 1987. It's essentially the same game, a pretty typical arcade football game of the 80s. At some point, Leland signed a deal with John Elway of the Broncos, who was one of the all-time great quarterbacks and one of the biggest figures in sports in the mid-80s. John Elway's Team Quarterback, another version of the same game essentially, hit arcades in 1988. Supposedly, Leland released a number of variations on this game in arcades back then, and there were also versions released on computers around the same time. Now, it's not surprising that Tradewest released the NES version, since Tradewest and Leland were closely related companies. Now, as you may have seen, other than the name of John Elway, this is a pretty generic-looking football game. You were given teams identified only by the city names, and I'm not really aware of any sort of individual stats for the teams or players. Now, we just recently saw Tecmo Bowl, and this game suffers quite a bit by comparison. The graphics are pretty dull, there is almost no music. It controls sorta like Tecmo Bowl. You choose a play. While controlling the quarterback, you use the D-pad to move around the cursor and select where you want to throw the ball to. However, in order to actually throw the ball, you hit down on the D-pad. It seems like they just could have used one of the buttons to throw the ball instead. That would have made more sense. Well, I'll admit, Rare did a pretty good job squeezing 18 players on the screen at once, at least from a purely technical perspective, though the action gets pretty confusing and the players can all sort of coagulate into one undifferentiated blob during plays. Despite the name on the box, John Elway doesn't seem to make any appearance whatsoever in the game. So it's not really that bad, but pretty unnecessary after Tecmo Bowl. Okay, that's it for US only games today. We are now at March 20th, and we've got another FDS game, this time from Pony Canyon. Oh boy, this looks promising. Hikaru Genji, Roller Panic. Yeah, you heard that right, Roller Panic. Note the copyright to Johnny and Associates there. Hikaru Genji is a very minor game. It's an extremely simple adventure game based on a Japanese boy band. So I guess this game is supposed to be aimed at girls. You need to put your info here. Naturally, blood type is among the things you'll have to select. Now pick a dude from the band. Huh, they all look more or less the same. Different hair, I suppose. Now, Hikaru Genji were a pretty darn popular band for a period of time in the late 80s and early 90s. At one point, they held the top 3 positions on the Japanese singles charts simultaneously. They were the product of Johnny & Associates, a music talent agency that virtually held a monopoly on Japanese boy bands since the 70s. They were actually run by a guy named Johnny Kitagawa, who was basically the Japanese Lou Pearlman, in that he got really rich throwing together boy bands, which gave him the opportunity to have his way with underage band members. Sorry, I mean allegedly had his way. So here are Hikaru Genji, a weird name, I know, since Hikaru Genji is the protagonist of the classic Japanese novel Tale of the Genji. On the other hand, the character of Hikaru Genji is sort of basically the prototype of the Bishonen, so maybe the name is sort of appropriate for the band. The band seems to have some sort of like roller skate theme going on, and the game's plot appears to revolve around the need to find the band's roller skates so the concert can go on. Okay, so you're probably saying, well, this doesn't look too bad, but what you see here is the entire game. This single screen set of locations, that's the entire game world. You walk around talking to folks until you find the roller skate. Then you repeat this for the remaining members. The end. The dialogue options differ for each member, but still, if you knew the correct paths for each member, you could plow through this game really quickly. Even compared to the other idle-type games, this really seems to give Hikaru Genji fans very little to enjoy. I mean, first of all, there's pretty much no music in the game, and it doesn't even really focus on the band members. And of course, you'll sort of have to try to ignore the fact that in real life, these characters were more than likely being molested by a middle-aged businessman at the time. Overall, it makes something like Noriko for the PC Engine look like a masterpiece. Another super obscure Japanese adventure game, this time from Tokyo Shoseki, the book publisher. The title of this game is Ankoku Shinwa, Yamato Takeru Densetsu, or as we would call it in English, The Dark Myth. While this game was never released outside of Japan, we do have this English translation from Snark, so we can attempt to appreciate this game. Ankoku is a pretty weird game, and part of this might be due to the subject, which is the legendary early history of Japan. Very briefly, the story concerns the Yamato people, who are generally described as being the ancestors of the modern-day Japanese people, and specifically one particular guy, Yamato Takeru, who is the son of the emperor. The larger story here is the conflict between two ethnic groups in old Japan, the Yamato and the Kumaso. Basically, the Yamato wiped out the Kumaso, who were supposedly a barbaric people. Eventually, the Yamato overran all the other tribes in Japan and then became the Japanese people. By the way, Yamato Takeru's sword, the Kusanagi, is currently one of the 3 pieces of Japanese imperial regalia. Supposedly, no one is allowed to see the imperial regalia, so hard facts about them are pretty scarce. Confusingly, according to the historical novel, Tale of the Heike, the sword was dropped in the sea and lost forever, so this whole ancient sword business is a bit fishy. Anyway, the game is based on a manga by a fellow named Daijiro Morohoshi. You see his name in the opening credits. It originally came out in the 1970s and later got an anime version in 1990 or so. The game was also released for the MSX in 1988. And you could probably guess its computer origins by looking at the screen layout, with all the space being taken up by the interface and the graphics being stuffed in like a little tiny box down at the bottom. So the game concerns a guy who is apparently the ancestor of Yamato Takeru, or maybe his reincarnation, I really can't tell. He investigates the murder of his father. This all ties into an ancestor or reincarnation of a Kumaso dude, who is apparently involved in the return of the Dark Gods, because supposedly the Kumaso people were evil, and thus genocide of the Kumaso at the hands of the Yamato was totally justified. As you can see, the interface is sort of weird. You have use, move, and walk, as well as get, see, and say, which are horribly abbreviated due to the problems with the translation of the compact Japanese text into English characters, which take up more space. You also have a bit of inventory on the upper right-hand corner. You see some icons there. Occasionally you will need to use or pick up items and then use them later, for example, to open the locked door or reveal a hidden passage or something. Here, for example, using the notebook and chanting a spell you found opens the door. And here's the first boss. A weird looking guy. His arms look chopped off and he has like a long, goofy neck. He's also pretty damned easy, though most of the bosses here are. Though you might not know that when you're fighting him for the first time, since neither he nor you have a life bar. So you have no idea if you're doing well or if you're one step away from death during the fight. After defeating each boss, you move on to the next chapter. Each chapter is completely discrete and there's no sort of backtracking possible. And each chapter is actually pretty linear as well. 8 chapters altogether, and a few of them are pretty short. and there's also some sort of time-traveling plot involved, I think. This was one of those games that as I played it, I kept thinking, what the hell is going on? The environments all seem to be caves, temples, that sort of thing. There seemed to be a lot of looking at inscriptions, finding various historic artifacts, gems, statues, ancient swords, all of which tend to have a very specific one-time use. It resembles a more linear Shadowgate, only with lots and lots of dialogue and a plot line that dictates what you do and where you go next. The most interesting part is probably the bosses. I mean, they're all pretty damn large and creepy looking, which is weird because the rest of the game is very unimpressive visually. So who developed Ankoku Shinwa? Primarily Zap, a tiny contract developer. Fortunately, Game Developer Research Institute has contacted Hitoshi Akashi, formerly of Zap and various other Japanese developers, so we have a bit of information on this game. It seems Zap designed the game and did the MSX version, and Akashi did the sound programming for the Famicom version, though the rest of the programming for the Famicom game was done by a company called Another. Akashi implies that the Famicom programming was done by just one guy, Naoki Morishima, who actually ran the company, Another. It's amazing to think what tiny staffs game developers had back then, especially compared to today where games have these huge staffs of hundreds of people. Alright, so we're approaching the end of the game here. The ending is a bit weird. You need to disguise yourself to confront your arch nemesis. Yamato Takeru was said to have disguised himself as a woman in order to assassinate the leader of the Kamaso, and Takeshi does something very similar here. However, if you fail to grab the coat and the scarf, your disguise is seen through and you get the bad ending where the Dark God is reborn. In order to get the good ending, or the real ending, you need to pick up both the coat and the scarf. Then when you talk to this guy, you'll end up fighting the final boss, which is apparently the Dark God that everybody's talking about. Like every boss in the game, he's pretty darn easy. The fact that you have a projectile weapon throwing sword makes fighting the boss battle pretty simple. After you defeated him, there's a little bit of ending exposition. As I mentioned earlier, I admit I have no idea what happens in the ending. But the Dark God is killed, everybody is happy, and then a volcano erupts. Is that supposed to be a good thing or a bad thing? Not sure. Ankoku Shinwa is different than your typical Princess Tomato type adventure game, but despite being translated into English, it's still pretty hard to get into. Whoa, fancy little graphic there. You can see all sorts of reflections and distortions and whatnot in that ball. Family Pinball is, well, it's a pinball game. The title screen indicates the involvement of the developer Artman in the game, but Game Developer Research Institute believes that KID, was involved in the development as well. There are 4 gameplay options. We'll start with the Pac-Man theme table. Once you choose your table, you then choose a character to play as, and it's all Namco themed stuff. You have options for up to 4 players when selecting your game. The Pac-Man table turns out to be a pretty generic table design with a few Pac-Man elements kind of stuck in the background. It's 2 screens tall, you have 2 sets of flippers. It's really nothing to write home about, but here's where things get a little weird. Let's check out the other options. 9-ball. This turns out to be an utterly ridiculous pinball-pachinko hybrid. Yes, pinball and pachinko. You start off with some money, you then place a bet and try to get the ball into the correct slot. However, the balls tend to find their way to the far left if you just drop them down and will go down the gutter on the left side if you don't tilt the table. And you don't even really use the flippers that much in this game. It's actually quite weird. Speaking of weird, the competitive pinball table is pretty damned unusual, and it's actually quite creative. You see, at the midpoint of the table, gravity is reversed, so once the ball reaches up to the upper half, gravity starts pulling it up. And as I mentioned, this is competitive. You win when the other player loses a ball. Furthermore, the flippers can be moved to multiple positions. There are even various sorts of offensive weapons that'll do things like freeze your opponent's flippers. This table comes in a couple different flavors. The first we saw was Bomb, and this here is Thunder. Finally, there is another competitive game, Sports. This is the ice hockey variation. You control a goalie and a weird flipper that can spin around freely in a full circle. Family Pinball was of course a Japanese title, but some of this stuff might look kind of familiar to you. That's because it was released in the US as Rock and Ball. Now remember, Namco was not releasing any NES games in the US at this point. All of the Namco games were licensed to other companies. So Rock and Ball ended up being in the hands of NTVIC, that is Nippon Television, though the name of the Nippon Television subsidiary, VAP, will also appear everywhere on the game and the box. All the Namco references were edited out. The Pac-Man pinball is just called Pinball according to this screen. I guess they tried to give the game some sort of rock and roll theme, but this really hardly comes across at all. Words like rock and shake are just sort of tacked on onto random spots. You'll notice Kid's name on the table, so they must have worked on the US version. For some reason, the Pachinko game made it intact, even though the back of the box claims this is quote-unquote bingo inspired. Other than a few logo changes, it's really the exact same game as the Japanese version. Now, hardcore pinball fans might not like this game. I mean, you see, the controls aren't that great. You can't really lightly hit the ball with your flipper. Even just barely tapping the button will send the ball flying pretty hard. So those players who make use of these advanced pinball techniques will probably not find that much use for the game. On the other hand, the competitive play options are pretty creative, so I guess Family Pinball wins points for originality, even as it loses points for lack of refinement. March is slowly winding down. We've now reached March 28th, and 2 games from Jaleco. First up is a cartridge, Jajamaru Ninpou Chou. Wow, so it's been a while since we've seen a Jajamaru game. This is, I believe, the 5th game in the Ninja-kun/Ninja Jajamaru series, making it the most prolific series on the Famicom so far. The other Jajamaru games were standard platformers, but now Jaleco has transformed it into an RPG. In fact, this is a pretty blatant Dragon Quest clone. Even Jajamaru himself has received a heavy makeover, losing the hooded ninja outfit. So, pretty typical stuff at the beginning. You head on to the village, buy some equipment, head outside, fight random battles. You know, the usual. However, the interesting thing is that Jaleco did make some attempts to release some of the Jajamaru games in the US. In fact, this game had a planned US release as Taro's Quest. This was never released, but a prototype of the localized version has been discovered. We'll take a look at this now. So in the intro, we learn that monsters are planning something treacherous. That's pretty vague. Doesn't really give you any sort of idea as to what you're supposed to do in the game. So right off the bat we see some changes were made. The Japanese version has a cutscene of you walking from the castle to the first town, and then started when you were already in the town. Taro's Quest starts you right outside the beginning castle and makes you walk to town. At this point you have no weapons, armor, magic, or items, and naturally there are enemies that can kill you, so you could die almost immediately in this game. Luckily, the run option almost always works. If you somehow make it to the village, you can heal at the inn for a mere 4 gold pieces, and naturally you'll want to buy some armor and a weapon. Also, talking to NPCs will sort of begin to fill you in on the plot and explain to you that you want to track down some magical orbs. You then do the typical fight monsters and gain experience and heal pattern. Everything is pretty much as you would expect in this sort of game. Taro's quest is not exactly jam-packed with character. The enemies all look pretty generic, the graphics are sort of dull, battles are pretty lame, at least at first. The only thing you can do is attack or run, or use an item I suppose. But there's absolutely no strategy involved, just sort of hitting the attack button over and over again, kinda like the first Dragon Quest game. Eventually things will improve. As you level up, you'll occasionally get a visit from the Buddha, who will grant you magic spells. The first and most immediately useful spell is the heal spell, which is called Feed in this game. Not really sure why. Later in the game you'll find other party members. Now aside from being translated in English, I should point out that the graphics have all been reworked for the planned US version. We'll just compare some of the characters and enemies. The Japanese version tends to use like these cutesy type character designs, whereas the English version uses slightly more realistic designs, and everything is not nearly as goofy looking. I mean, even Jajamaru himself has been de-animified. For some reason, Jellicoe is quite insistent on getting a Jajamaru game out in the West. A bit later, a game called Ninja Jajamaru, Ginga Daisakuzen, which was a Famicom game from 1991, was localized as Squashed, but then once again cancelled. However, a Game Boy title, Oira Jajamaru, was released in the US as Maru's Mission, and another Game Boy release, Sengoku Ninja-kun, was released in the US as Ninja Taro. Now this is your first boss, by the way. He has a pretty decent life bar, so you'll probably need to heal a few times in battle. Once you've defeated him, you'll get an orb, which will grant you a lightning spell. At some point you're going to need to buy an absurdly expensive cake, 50 gold pieces, and trade it for a portable bridge, Zelda style, which allows you to cross a river. Not sure why the cake would cost so much, that's more than most of the weapons or armor at this point. Jajamaru Ninpou Chou is not too terribly interesting based just on its own merits. I suppose it does bear witness to the changing trends in video games and the increasing popularity of RPGs in Japan. However, Jellicoe couldn't quite settle on a particular genre for this series, and later games ended up being quite different than this one, before the series, finally died out. By the way, should you try to play this game, just realize that the English version is not actually completed and cannot be finished. I believe you can only get around 2/3 of the way through the game itself, so if you try to play it, be forewarned. You just gotta love the FDS. Obsolete in 1989 by technological standards, it just keeps chugging along as a depository for cheap, quickly made, or old-fashioned games. Big Challenge Gunfighter is the latest in Jellicoe's Big Challenge series. The first two were a judo game and a horizontal shoot-'em-up, neither of which were very interesting. I'm really not sure what the theme of the Big Challenge series is supposed to be. I guess it's just cheap FDS games on different genres. Gunfighter is like a Wild West themed scrolling run-and-gun, I suppose. Remember Capcom's Gunsmoke? Sort of like a terrible side-scrolling version of that, or maybe a primitive version of Konami's Lone Ranger game. So you're the guy in blue, apparently you just walk forward and shoot everyone, and hey, what happened here? How is my health getting depleted already? Do you see that green crate on the right that looks a little different than the others? Somehow stepping on that causes you to lose health. I don't know how or why, but avoid stepping on the crates with those weird little vertical stripes. Other than that, you just try to avoid getting shot by the various enemy gunmen that run around. It's actually pretty tough to not get shot a lot, since you've always got guys that are just constantly shooting at you all the time. Sometimes when you kill them, you'll pick up a health refill or more ammo, or even money, which can be used to buy more ammo from the guy at the beginning of the level. But here's the thing, I have no idea how to play Gunfighter. When I reached the end of the level, I simply restarted at the beginning. When this happens, your health and ammo don't refill. So I ended up getting looped around over and over again on the first level until I just ran out of health or ammo. And eventually the game ended. I have no idea how to get to level 2. Of course, Gunfighter is so terrible I really don't want to see level 2. I guess there's some sort of task you have to perform on level 1 in order to move on, but really what could it be? Other than shooting guys, there doesn't seem to be much to do. Anyway, there'll be one more big challenge FDS game before Jalico kills the series and exits the FDS for good. Great music, but not such a great game. This is yet another Sega arcade game released on the Famicom by Sunsoft. It's Afterburner, or more precisely, Afterburner 2. I'm sure I don't need to introduce Afterburner to you guys. You already know the arcade game was a super intense, fast-paced game with tons of explosions and rockin' music. And of course, Sega's cool sprite-based 3D graphics. There wouldn't be a console that could replicate this until the 32-bit era, but that didn't stop Sega from porting it to the Master System, and now Sunsoft to the Famicom, and the results are less than spectacular. Afterburner is not a very deep game. Basically, you play it for the audio-visual overload appeal. If you take that away, the game is not that fun. This is why the Famicom version and the Master System version fail. Not surprisingly, there was a US release by Tengen under the name Afterburner, as opposed to Sunsoft's Afterburner 2. Afterburner and Afterburner 2 were essentially the same arcade game. 2 had a different title screen and some graphics and gameplay tweaks, but it wasn't really a sequel, despite the name. Likewise, the Tengen version is a little bit different from the Sunsoft version, mostly noticeable in the colors. I'm not sure which one came first, or why the changes were made, but neither version is really very good. Anyway, Afterburner is, as far as I'm aware, the last Sega arcade game to be released on the Famicom by Sunsoft. There will be an NES version of Sega's Shinobi from Tengen later on in 1989, however. Oh boy, we got another winner here. Putt Putt Golf. I bet that golf ball's either going to land in the hole or hit him on the head. See? I told you so. This FDS game from Pack-In Video is yet another golf game. But at least it's not the typical run-of-the-mill example of the golf genre. Instead, this is a wacky golf game. Can't be really called miniature golf, but the courses are all weird. As you see, there's 4 courses, each with its own theme. Cakes, sports, toys, and animals. These are all fantasy golf courses, and as a result, putt-putt golf is a bit different than most of the other golf games. Here's cakes. Why cakes? It's a pretty random subject for a golf course. But as we can see, it has various obstacles based on baked goods and terrifying giant ants. From a game mechanics standpoint, putt-putt's really not that different from what we've been seeing in golf games. You have the power meter thing used to swing your club. One annoying thing is that you always have to manually move your pointer before taking a shot. A lot of the games automatically point the reticule in the right direction, or at least the general right direction, especially when putting. But here, for each shot, the pointer's always pointing in the wrong direction. So for every single shot, you have to swing the reticule back around towards the hole. I suppose your overall strategy is going to have to be a bit different in this game. Since there's all these kinds of obstacles on the course, you'll need to move your ball in a path around the gingerbread houses and soccer nets and whatnot. So much like Family Pinball, it's a new take on an old game, but in this case I really wouldn't recommend giving putt-putt golf a try. Alright, March 31st, here at last. I'll level with you guys on this one. Operation Wolf is not a game that I'm good at. I don't really have much luck with this game. But still, it's a classic of a sort, I suppose. You probably all know this game. It's a first-person shooting game that gives you the options in the NES version of using either the light gun or the D-pad. Taito released this in Japan first on March 31st, but they actually released the US NES version pretty darn quickly in May 1989. So there was very little delay between the Japanese Famicom release and the US release. Operation Wolf was a pretty big hit in the arcades when it came out in 1987, so Taito probably had high hopes for the home version. This should look pretty familiar here, your basic Rambo-inspired light gun game. You walk through various enemy bases and shoot everybody. Well, you don't shoot the good guys. Frequently soldiers will jump right out in front of you and start blasting away at point-blank range. It's a reasonably fun quarter muncher. Now for the home release, not too much was changed. Of course, the graphics aren't nearly as good, the enemy soldiers are smaller and more nondescript looking, and you don't have like those huge enemy sprites appearing in the foreground. The explosions and sound effects and whatnot are all much more subdued. I'm not saying this is bad exactly, but just quite a bit of the arcade game's appeal is lost. Now the rules are simple, you shoot enemies, but don't shoot civilians. Your ammo is limited, so you need to be constantly shooting at those little ammo refill icons that appear. You have a stash of grenades that are good for taking out tanks and helicopters. It is pretty darn hard, however. There's always several enemies on the screen at once, usually shooting at you, so you tend to get shot a lot. So it seems like your health is always draining while you're playing this game. I died quite a few times playing Operation Wolf, and it's a pretty repetitive game, really. This is basically the whole game right here, it's just shooting soldiers. So, Operation Wolf, the arcade version, I guess is like a classic, important title, and one of the first really popular games of this genre in arcades, but the home version is not quite as interesting. Alright, we've reached the end of March, and here's this episode's most well-known game, probably, Shadowgate from Kemco. This is the second MacVenture game released for the NES by Kemco, the first being of course Deja Vu, which we've already covered, and the last being The Uninvited. In the US at least, Shadowgate is the most popular of the three MacVenture games, and this might have to do with the fact that it was released first. Originally, the games were released for the Macintosh computer, with Deja Vu being the first game and Shadowgate being the last. Kemco then released each game in Japan for the Famicom, first Deja Vu, then Shadowgate, then Uninvited. However, in the US, Shadowgate was released before Deja Vu. It actually came out in late 1989, with Deja Vu hitting the shelves in 1990. The computer versions, such as those for the Mac, DOS, and the Amiga, make use of the mouse. The MacVenture games were among the first of what we'd call point-and-click adventure games. The mouse-based interface made interacting with the game much easier than in older games that used text parsers. Now for the Famicom versions of these, the interface was clearly going to have to be redesigned. So you now used a D-pad to move around a cursor and then select options on the command window or the inventory window, which is actually called goods here. So you begin outside of Shadowgate Castle. The first step would appear to be opening the door and going inside, however doing so will quickly lead you to a dead end, and because there's only more locked doors inside. Shadowgate demonstrates its insidiousness from the get-go. So you can look around, look at everything, it'll give you little descriptions, you can fool around by hitting stuff, but nothing seems unusual. However, in order to progress past the first room, you need to use the open command on the skull, which unexpectedly pops out and gives you a key. So the game pretty much screws with you from step 1. There is a hint feature which can sometimes be helpful, but even more so than Deja Vu, Shadowgate relies on these weird arbitrary puzzles. Though probably the way that Shadowgate screws you the most is with the constant deaths. For example, in the second room in the castle you see a book. Okay, so you look at it, doesn't really tell you much, so using adventure game logic you decide you should pick it up. Really, in these games, you should pick up everything that's not nailed down because you never know, you might need it later. And then the floor opens up and you fall to your death. Yeah, you see, Shadowgate is just one of those games where you can die on almost every single screen. But you know, that's okay, because dying just means you get an entertaining description of your demise, and then you start basically just one step backwards where you were. So the frequent deaths are irritating, but they're not nearly as punishing as like those of Sierra games. As for the types of deaths, oh, there are so many. Look, there's a trapdoor, the ladder. Let's climb down the ladder, and oops, I fell and I died. Green slime. Oops, well, I guess I got too close to it and died. Here's another trapdoor. Not having learned my lesson, I jump down and break both my legs. Now that's a slow, painful death right there. Ooh, and there's a dragon at the end of the hall, and all this loot. Well, this has got to be important, so I'll just grab a piece, and I'm roasted to death. And of course, you know, let's not forget the classic. Your torch burns out, and you trip in the dark and break your neck. Shadowgate requires you to be constantly picking up torches and then lighting them. You can also kill yourselves many ways. Use the torch on yourself a few times and you catch on fire and die. You can use almost any weapon on yourself, and then the game will chastise you for committing suicide. This is actually quite similar to Deja Vu, so it appears that ICOM had sort of a suicide fetish of sorts. So anyway, aside from all the various deaths in this game, sometimes just the required actions to go forward and make progress are just a bit obscure. For example, this guy blocks your path. Now you collect torches throughout the game, but notice how that one torch is listed separately. It's between key 1 and key 2. You need to use your regular torch on that one separate torch, and then somewhat unexpectedly it turns out to be like a magic torch and you automatically kill this guy. But this would really only come about through pure guesswork. Sometimes things sort of make sense, like the word Epor written above the rope. Turns out Epor is the name of a spell that you learn by reading that sign twice. You do learn several magical spells in Shadowgate, but they're only useful for exactly one time each, and always in a very special situation. That's sort of like a recurring video game pet peeve, where a game gives you a weapon or an ability that's useful exactly once and will never be needed again. So once you get further into the game, you'll encounter some enemies that are blocking your way. Normally you deal with these guys by using a weapon against them, but it's always some very specific weapon. When you encounter a troll on a bridge, only the spear will work. Against this guy, the sling has to be used, and it'll work only if you just happen to pick up some rather innocuous looking rocks you found lying around earlier. The rule is, if you can pick it up, then take it, unless of course it's something that kills you when you take it, like that book that we saw earlier. Quite frankly, the number of things like keys, weapons, gems, scepters, rings, crests, and so on get a bit overwhelming. Virtually every screen has something that you're supposed to pick up, and you use these items to unlock doors and kill monsters, but it's not normally clear what any item is used for, so it's really a lot of trial and error. Here's one example. You need to fool around with these switches until you move the lid and reveal an item inside that thing there. This is not really so much a puzzle as it is guessing. If anything, Shadowgate features more guesswork than Deja Vu. At least the murder mystery game had some sort of logical pattern, but in Shadowgate a lot of this stuff seems just plain random. When you encounter a door that you have to put a gem in to open, how do you know whether to use the red gem or the blue gem? There actually is technically a plot in Shadowgate. You need to stop the Warlock Lord from resurrecting the world-destroying behemoth, which is a biblically based beast, often described as a giant bull or something, though here he's kind of like a dragon. Shadowgate is obviously much less character-driven than Deja Vu. Your character rarely says anything and has no personality whatsoever. There's none of the clever, hard-boiled dialogue writing that you found in Deja Vu. Instead, we just have some prosaic descriptions of your surroundings. And rather than trying to solve a mystery based on your lost memories, the object here is simply how to figure out how to get through the castle and find the warlock at the bottom. This involves lots of experimentation, fooling around, and dying a lot. As with Deja Vu, the D-pad can't really take the place of the mouse when it comes to being used in this control scheme. The pointer moves really slowly around the screen, and stuff like having to use two commands to get through a door, first open and then move, makes the game much slower than it should be. But it's not a bad game, and despite the issues, it's not nearly as irritating and arbitrary as something like Jesus Biomonster. Shadowgate is still pretty fun to play, so I wouldn't say that I wouldn't recommend it. Now, this is kind of odd. While in the US, Shadowgate's considered to be kind of like a classic, for the system, in Japan it's apparently considered to be Kosoge. Mostly due to the frequent deaths, but also the bizarre, flowery descriptions of the deaths that are given in the Japanese language. Apparently in Japanese, this game sounds quite silly. From the perspective of someone in 2012, it's kind of hard to know what to make of Shadowgate. It was one of the first ports of a computer adventure game released on a console, and it introduced many young gamers to the adventure game. On the other hand, it isn't exactly the Secret of Monkey Island as far as adventure games go. So let's call it a flawed and primitive minor classic. Oh, wonderful. Another baseball game. Just what I needed. This is Home Run Nighter Pennant League from Data East, a relatively obscure game which spawned a very short-lived series. There were only 2 Home Run Nighter games, I believe. Pretty nice title screen, though. I like the cool illustration of the stadium at nighttime, the city lights flashing. Definitely a good title screen. But what about the game? Well, it's your basic by-the-book Japanese baseball game. You choose between various fictional teams with weird names. I like the name Butta. Each team has a detailed roster, and apparently each player has their own stats. Even the manager portraits are pretty well done, and I kind of suspect that they might be based on real-life baseball managers. So as we can see, the Home Run Nighter is very much in the tradition of Namco's Family Stadium series. We have kind of similar depictions of the players being short and round and cartoonish. The major difference is that Home Run Nighter uses a few different graphics for its players. Some guys are taller and have different faces, so every single player does not look exactly alike. Beyond that, what can we really say about this game? It's just like every other similar game. A lot of the typical complaints that I have about these baseball games also apply to Home Run Nighter, especially when playing against the CPU. It's hard to hit the ball, and I got way too many foul balls. However, in this case, the CPU has the same problem, as demonstrated here, where the CPU hit about 10 foul balls in a row. Now when you do get a good hit in, the ball seems magnetically attracted to the gloves of the outfielders. I mean, look at this, do the outfielders even need to move, or do the balls go directly to them? Either way, the CPU never misses a catch. On the other hand, you'll miss lots of catches because you can't see where outfielders are until the ball is almost ready to land. You need to get your players in the correct positions, but since you cannot see where they are as the camera is slowly panning across the field, it's really difficult to move them to the right spot. So, in conclusion, I'm getting tired of all these damned baseball games. Oh god, here we are at last. The end of March. Game 20 this episode. This is the second Akira Matsumoto game, the first being from February 2008. You might not remember that game, but it was a stock market financial simulation type game, based around the real-life financial guru Akira Matsumoto. But this is really one thing I don't want to have to deal with right now. A Japanese stock market simulation game? I mean, look at the crap I had to put up with this episode, and now this? I mean, for God's sake, you actually have to name 3 characters, not 1 but 3, and then you have to fill in their attributes. You choose their social status, I think it is, and then you have to give them a certain amount of money to start off with, I believe. Really, the object here is to make a lot of money through the stock market, but that only scratches the surface. It seems this game is much bigger and much more complicated than the first one. So here's your main screen. The market doesn't open till 9, so until then you can check the news, look at your day planner, all kinds of stuff. Once the market opens, you can buy and sell stocks, but there's lots more. You can borrow money, buy real estate, you have to deal with your wife and family, you can take a mistress, win the lottery, get in car accidents. It's almost like a life simulator. And not content to just have you look at various boring text-filled screens, this game lets you travel to various locations and then, get this, wander around in first-person 3D mazes. As you walk through these things, you'll find weird things like jewelry stores and fortune tellers and of course property for sale. So I guess all this looks really cool, but honestly this is way too complicated for me. If this game were in English and I had the instruction manual, I still probably wouldn't be able to figure all this out. This is like one of those old school computer games where after a while of trying to figure it out, you go, you know, this game is just not worth the effort. Still, I guess it's a pretty commendable effort from Imagineer Infinity. I mean, how many video games let you cheat on your wife and get divorced? Alright, I'm glad that's over with. So, what's on the agenda for episode 44? Well, Namco is going to dominate next episode with 4 games. But we also have a classic game from Technos Japan. We're actually going to have some bonus content as well, and that's going to take a pretty decent chunk of the episode. So only 12 actual Famicom games will be covered. Regardless, it's going to be a pretty substantial episode, so be prepared.